crime documentary presents. In the shadows of America's darkest crimes lies a story that shook the nation to its very core. A story of innocence stolen, of trust betrayed, and of a brutal act that left a family shattered forever. This is not just another crime, it is the haunting tale of a young woman full of dreams, whose life was taken in the most tragic way. The murder of Reagan Tokes is more than a crime, it is a chilling reminder of how fragile life can be. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind the tragic murder of Reagan Tokes, a crime that shook America. Reagan Tokes was 21 years old, a young woman full of life, dreams, and ambition, a student at the Ohio State University, where she was studying diligently while balancing part-time work at a local restaurant. She was someone everyone admired, her smile lighting up rooms, her laughter contagious, and her presence comforting to those around her. Reagan was known for her kindness, always willing to help, always considerate, and she carried herself with a quiet strength that drew people toward her. That particular evening in February 2017 started like any other, a routine night for a young woman navigating the challenges of college life, juggling classes, work, and friendships. She had finished her shift at the restaurant, tired from the long hours, but looking forward to returning to her small apartment, a space she called her sanctuary, a place where she could unwind and relax, perhaps make a cup of tea, listen to music, and prepare for the next day. The streets of Columbus were calm for the late hour, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from earlier rainfall, casting eerie shadows that seemed almost alive, shifting and stretching as cars passed, and the wind whispered through the trees, a stark contrast to the warmth and security she felt in her mind as she walked toward her car. Reagan's thoughts were typical for a young adult finishing a long day, focused on what she needed to do, the assignments pending, maybe catching up with a friend on the phone. But she could not have imagined that this ordinary night would turn into a nightmare, one that would snatch her future and her life away in an instant. As she approached her car, parked along the quiet street, there was a sense of normalcy, yet danger often hides in plain sight and in the shadows. Someone watched her movements with intentions so dark, so sinister that it would be impossible to comprehend. Brian Goldsby, a man with a long criminal history, a man who had been released from prison after serving time for violent offenses, was in the vicinity, observing, calculating, and ready to commit an act that would shock a nation. He had been fitted with a GPS ankle monitor, a tool meant to control and track his movements, but it did nothing to stop him, nothing to prevent the evil that was about to unfold. Reagan, unaware of the danger, unlocked her car, placed her bag inside, and prepared to drive home. Her steps were careful, her thoughts simple and mundane, yet destiny had a different plan. As she opened the car door, the man emerged from the shadows, his presence sudden and terrifying, his intentions clear and malicious. He confronted her immediately, his demands forceful, his voice cold, devoid of empathy, as he threatened her with a gun, a weapon that instantly changed her world, turning what was supposed to be a safe, ordinary night into a life-threatening ordeal. Reagan's heart raced, her mind spinning, trying to understand the situation, to find a way out. But the reality was cruel, the danger real, and the grip of fear was overwhelming. The streets, once familiar and harmless, now felt like a trap, every passing car a potential witness, every distant sound a reminder of her vulnerability. She was forced into the car, her body trembling, her mind trying to process the sudden violence, the betrayal of safety she had always taken for granted. Goldsby took control, directing her movements, demanding compliance, and stripping away every sense of autonomy she had, leaving her in a state of terror, helplessness, and disbelief. Each turn of the car, each moment in the passenger seat, intensified the nightmare, as Reagan realized that the person she was with was not just a criminal, but a predator capable of unimaginable acts. The minutes stretched endlessly, the city around them fading into a blur of darkness and fear. And Reagan's thoughts shifted from disbelief to survival, the instinct to live battling the terror that gripped her heart. She tried to remain calm, to reason, to find any way to appeal to the humanity of the man who had taken control. But there was none, only cold calculation and ruthless intent. In those hours, Reagan's world contracted to the immediate, the urgent need to stay alive, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would intervene, that fate would somehow spare her, that the darkness surrounding her could be broken. The streets of Columbus, the city she had walked countless times, now became an arena of fear, every corner hiding potential danger, every shadow a reminder of the fragility of life, and the chilling realization that her fate was now entirely in the hands of a man who had no regard for it. Her phone, her lifeline, was out of reach, her freedom curtailed, and the young woman who had been full of dreams, laughter, and life was now trapped, held hostage by a predator who had been allowed back into society despite his history of violence. The injustice of it all weighed on her in those moments, the bitter reality that her life, her bright future, could be extinguished by a single cruel act, while systems meant to protect society had failed to prevent it. As the night wore on, Reagan tried to think, to strategize, to look for any possible chance of escape, her mind racing despite the fear and the chaos of the situation, clinging to the hope that survival was still possible, that she could somehow endure the ordeal. But the man beside her was relentless, his control absolute, and the night stretched on as a terrifying continuum of power, fear, and uncertainty. The ordinary evening had transformed into a nightmare that no one could imagine. The safety of home, the warmth of family, and the simple act of walking to one's car now shattered by the presence of a predator. Reagan's life, her hopes, her dreams, and her very existence were now imperiled, each passing moment bringing her closer to a fate that would leave the nation in shock and mourning, and the city of Columbus grappling with a horror that seemed both incomprehensible and all too real, a tragedy that would leave scars on everyone who learned her story. Brian Goldsby was a man whose presence alone sent chills down the spine, a predator who had a long history of violent behavior, arrests and convictions, and yet, despite his past, he had been released back into society, his freedom monitored only by a GPS ankle bracelet, a device that could not contain the darkness that had taken root in his mind, a darkness that would soon collide with the life of an innocent young woman, Reagan Tokes. That night, after confronting Reagan and forcing her into her own car, Goldsby exerted complete control, his voice sharp, commanding, devoid of empathy, as he demanded she comply with every order. And from that moment on, Reagan's world was no longer her own. Each turn of the vehicle, each stoplight, each street they drove down was now a prison of terror, and Reagan's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening, trying desperately to hold on to any shred of hope that she might survive the ordeal, that somehow fate would intervene before it was too late. The fear she felt was not abstract. It was physical, gripping her chest, making her hands tremble, her heart pound violently, as the reality of her situation pressed down on her like a weight she could not escape. She tried to reason with Goldsby, to appeal to whatever sense of humanity might exist within him, pleading for mercy, explaining that she had done nothing to deserve this. But her words fell on deaf ears, swallowed by the cold emptiness in his eyes and the lethal determination in his movements. For hours, Goldsby drove her through the streets of Columbus, a city that seemed endless, filled with shadows and potential witnesses, yet somehow invisible to anyone who might intervene. And Reagan's mind worked furiously to memorize every landmark, every turn, every detail that might later serve as evidence, as a way for someone to find her if she did not survive the night, clinging to the hope that her awareness, her observation, could become a lifeline in a nightmare she had not asked for. He demanded her money, her phone, anything he could take to exert dominance, and Reagan complied, her survival instincts overriding fear, panic, and outrage, her young life now a careful negotiation with a man capable of violence she could hardly comprehend. Each minute was an eternity. Each glance at the darkened streets outside filled with the terror that at any moment her fate could be sealed. The car, once a symbol of independence and freedom, had become a cage, a moving prison, and every mile brought her closer to a reality she could not yet face, one that would forever change her family, her friends, and a city that would soon learn of the horror that had occurred that night. Reagan's mind tried to remain sharp, to assess any possible opportunity to escape, to create a plan, however small, to regain some measure of control over her situation. But Goolsby's presence was overpowering, his behavior unpredictable, his intent clear. He spoke little, but his actions were deliberate, each movement reinforcing the fact that he had power over her life, over her choices. And the young woman who had walked so freely through life just hours before was now a captive, her every thought focused on surviving the relentless night. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated by stops at ATMs, interactions with strangers who were oblivious to the unfolding terror, and the driving that seemed to have no end, leaving Reagan suspended in a liminal space between hope and despair, life and the encroaching shadow of death that followed Goolsby wherever he went. Her body ached, her mind raced, yet she remained vigilant, aware that any sudden movement, any attempt to resist, could provoke him, and she had learned through instinct that survival often depended on calm compliance, on reading the nuances of a predator's behavior, on remaining silent yet alert, every nerve and sense heightened to an almost unbearable degree, as she tried to negotiate each moment with the only tools she had left: her wits, her resilience, and the faint hope that her ordeal might end without the ultimate cost. The darkness outside mirrored the darkness in the car, a symbol of the unknown, a canvas upon which her terror was painted with every mile, every turn, every shadowy figure that passed the vehicle. Columbus, a city that had been familiar, safe, now seemed alien and threatening. Each street an extension of the prison she could not escape, and every passing hour a reminder of the fragility of life, the unpredictability of fate, and the cruel indifference of a man whose humanity had long since been abandoned. As the night progressed, Reagan's mind alternated between panic and calculation, terror and observation, trying to find patterns in Goolsby's behavior, trying to commit details to memory, anything that could later provide evidence, anything that could help authorities piece together the horror she was enduring. She noted the streets, the buildings, the few lights that flickered in the distance, the turns and stops, hoping that these observations could one day help someone understand, capture, and punish the man responsible for her suffering. She imagined her family, her friends, wondering where she was, and the thought of their anguish strengthened her determination to survive, to endure the ordeal despite the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume her entirely. Her body remained tense, every muscle primed for potential action, yet every thought suppressed the urge to resist overtly, because she understood instinctively that survival required patience, awareness, and the careful navigation of an unpredictable and dangerous man who had no regard for human life. The hours dragged on, the cityscape blurred, and the night became a haunting corridor of fear, suspense, and uncertainty, a chilling prelude to the ultimate act of violence that would later stun the nation and forever etch Reagan Tokes' name into the dark chronicles of crime history. The night had grown colder, the streets quieter, and the darkness heavier, as Brian Goolsby continued his relentless control over Reagan Tokes, driving her further from the city lights into areas that felt abandoned, isolated, and suffocating. Each turn of the wheel seemed calculated, deliberate, a methodical orchestration that left Reagan with no sense of direction, no hope of escape, and only the chilling awareness that she was completely at his mercy, a captive of a man whose criminal history was long and whose capacity for violence was terrifyingly real. Her thoughts raced, cycling between fear, disbelief, and the desperate need to survive, each passing minute deepening the terror that had consumed her since she had been forced into the car. And as the night stretched on, the reality of her vulnerability became impossible to ignore. Every sound outside the vehicle, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a streetlight, the faint noises of nocturnal animals was amplified in her mind. Each one a potential signal of danger, each one a reminder that she was trapped, alone with a predator who had no empathy, no remorse, and no hesitation. Goolsby's behavior remained controlled, his movements precise, his tone cold and commanding, a stark reflection of the danger she faced. Reagan remained vigilant, her instincts sharpened to an almost unbearable edge, as she tried to anticipate his next move, searching for any sign of vulnerability, any chance, however small, to reclaim a moment of agency. But it was a hopeless endeavor. The city of Columbus, which she had once navigated confidently, had become an alien landscape, streets and neighborhoods unfamiliar in the depth of night, shadows stretching across vacant lots and empty parks. And every mile that Goolsby drove reinforced the realization that she was now in the hands of someone who could end her life at any moment. Her mind clung to memories of friends, family, and the life she had built, seeking solace in recollection, trying to maintain a fragile sense of identity as the night threatened to strip away everything that made her hold. Hours passed as Goolsby forced her to comply with his demands, taking money from ATMs, removing her personal belongings, and demonstrating the cold, calculating nature of his mind, the willingness to exert total dominance over another human being without hesitation or thought of consequence. Reagan's body ached from tension, from fear, from sitting for hours in a confined space with no control over her own fate. Yet her mind remained sharp, aware that observation, memory, and composure could be the only tools left to preserve her life. She meticulously noted streets, landmarks, and the sequence of events, driven by the hope that if she did not survive, someone else could use her observations to bring Goolsby to justice. And her survival instincts merged with an acute awareness of the dangers surrounding her, creating a tense equilibrium that allowed her to endure the unthinkable. Eventually, Goolsby drove to an area that was remote and isolated, a place where the cover of darkness was total, and where no witnesses could see, hear, or intervene. The silence of the surroundings was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the car's engine and the subtle movements within it, the tension in the air almost tangible. Reagan's heart raced as the full reality of her situation hit her. She was completely alone, at the mercy of a man who had proven over hours that he had no regard for life, no moral compass, and no hesitation to carry out his darkest impulses. The isolated park, with its overgrown paths, empty benches, and shadows stretching across desolate open spaces, became the setting for the final act of a nightmare she had been trapped in for hours, a place where the consequences of the night would reach their terrifying conclusion. Goolsby's actions became more deliberate, more focused as he prepared to commit the ultimate act of violence, and Reagan, aware of the escalating danger, tried to prepare herself, to brace for what was coming, to hold on to the hope that survival was still possible, that somehow she could escape the clutches of a man whose intent had been clear for hours. She attempted to speak, to reason, to plead, yet the words seemed small, powerless, inadequate against the absolute control he wielded, and the reality of her helplessness became undeniable. The night, once filled with the potential for escape or intervention, had closed in completely, leaving her trapped in a nightmare without pause, without relief, and without the chance to reclaim even a moment of normalcy. As Goolsby moved with precision, the hours of terror culminated in a horrifying act, an execution of violence so final and complete that it erased the potential for survival. Reagan, despite her efforts to maintain composure, could not escape the cruelty of the moment, and in the desolate stillness of the park, the violence was carried out, leaving her lifeless in the cold darkness, a young life full of potential extinguished by the hands of a man who had walked free despite a history of aggression and brutality. The setting, the darkness, the isolation all amplified the horror, turning a remote park into the scene of a tragedy that would shock an entire city, a state, and eventually a nation. The hours that followed, the discovery of her body, and the initial reports created a ripple of disbelief and horror, as the community grappled with the reality that someone so innocent, so full of life, could be subjected to such violence, and that a predator had been allowed back into society despite the risk he posed. The implications of the crime, the failures of the monitoring system, and the complete disregard for human life embodied in Goolsby's actions sent shockwaves through Columbus and beyond, leaving everyone who learned of the murder with a sense of helplessness, outrage, and sorrow that could not easily be assuaged. The tragedy was not only in the act itself, but in the context. A young woman's life stolen in a city where safety should have been a given, where systems designed to protect had failed, and where evil had been given a chance to operate unchecked. The investigation into Reagan Tokes' disappearance began almost immediately, the moment her body was discovered in that isolated park, a place so desolate it seemed impossible that anyone could have survived there. Yet it had been the final stage of a nightmare that began hours earlier with a simple walk to her car. Police quickly began piecing together the horrifying details, following leads, reviewing surveillance footage, and tracing the movements of Brian Goolsby, the man whose history of violence and criminal behavior had made him a known threat, yet whose release into society had been allowed under a system that failed to prevent this tragedy. Goolsby's GPS, ankle monitor, a device designed to keep track of his whereabouts, became a critical piece of evidence, placing him exactly where Reagan had been abducted. And slowly the story of the night unfolded, revealing a chilling narrative of terror, manipulation, and ultimate violence. The investigators worked tirelessly, interviewing anyone who might have seen or interacted with Goolsby that night, reconstructing the sequence of events with painstaking detail. They learned of his repeated stops, his demands for money, and the terrifying control he maintained over Reagan throughout the hours of her abduction. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the horrific ordeal she had endured, from the moment she was forced into her own car to the final moments when her life was cruelly taken. As the details emerged, the community was gripped with a mixture of outrage, sorrow, and disbelief, struggling to comprehend how such a young woman, full of life and promise, could be subjected to such a brutal and preventable crime. Families, students, and neighbors mourned collectively, and the tragedy sparked conversations about criminal justice reform, the dangers posed by repeat offenders, and the systems in place that allowed someone like Goolsby to roam free despite his past. During the investigation, the forensic evidence collected from Reagan's body and the surrounding area became central to the case, confirming the violent nature of her death and establishing the timeline with precision. Bloodstains, DNA samples, and the analysis of her clothing all pointed to a premeditated act of cruelty, and when combined with the GPS tracking data, the narrative became undeniable. Authorities were able to link every movement of Goolsby that night to Reagan's abduction and eventual murder, leaving no room for doubt. Witnesses who had noticed Goolsby's car, who saw interactions that initially seemed harmless or coincidental, now provided crucial corroboration, helping investigators solidify the chain of events that led to the tragic loss of an innocent life. Each new detail added weight to the mounting evidence, creating a comprehensive picture of a calculated predator who had exploited every opportunity to commit his crime. The trial of Brian Goolsby became a national story, a legal battle that captured the attention of people far beyond Columbus. Prosecutors meticulously presented the evidence, demonstrating not only the heinousness of the crime itself, but also the repeated failures of the system to protect society from a known violent offender. Reagan's family took the stand, their grief raw and visible, sharing stories of her kindness, ambition, and the bright future that had been stolen from them. They painted a portrait of a young woman whose life had been full of promise, dreams, and love, making the details of her final hours all the more devastating. The courtroom became a stage where justice for Reagan was pursued, where the horrors of that night were laid bare, and where the human cost of systemic failure was paid painfully clear to all who witnessed the proceedings. As the trial unfolded, Goolsby showed little remorse, his cold demeanor reinforcing the perception of him as a dangerous and remorseless individual. The jury listened to the exhaustive testimony, reviewed the forensic evidence, and considered the GPS data, ultimately understanding the calculated and deliberate nature of his actions. Every detail presented was a testament to the meticulous planning and callousness of the crime, and as the trial drew to a close, the weight of the evidence left little doubt that Goolsby had committed one of the most shocking murders in recent memory. The court sentenced him to life in prison without parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person. But even this ultimate punishment could not undo the loss, the heartbreak, and the grief caused by his actions. In the aftermath, Reagan's death became a catalyst for change, prompting lawmakers and community leaders to reevaluate how violent offenders are monitored and released, and to push for reforms that could prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Her story reminded the nation of the fragile nature of life, the importance of vigilance, and the consequences of systemic failure. Families across the country empathized with the unimaginable pain endured by Reagan's loved ones, and her name became a symbol, a rallying point for advocacy and awareness. The murder of Reagan Tokes was not just a crime. It was a national tragedy that exposed the darkness lurking within society and the gaps in the systems meant to protect the innocent. Reagan's legacy, though born from tragedy, continues to inspire action, compassion, and vigilance. Her life, though cut tragically short, serves as a reminder of the preciousness of every moment, the importance of safeguarding one another, and the enduring need for justice. The story of that fateful night, of the abduction, the terror, and the ultimate loss, will forever remain etched in the collective memory, a haunting reminder of the consequences of evil and the resilience of those left behind to honor the memory of a young woman whose life deserved so much more. The tragic murder of Reagan Tokes remains a crime that shook America, a story of horror, heartbreak, and a call to ensure that no one else has to endure the same fate.